we're ready to go. Our main speaker, Julian Baginni. We're very, very glad to have him here. You will have read his articles in Humanité, and there is a little bio at the back of the program if you want to know more. I will try to give them as much time as possible to be interesting. So, over from me to Julian.
Thank you. Have a glass.
No pressure.
No pressure, thank you. I understand the last speaker is a particularly entertaining one. I thought, oh dear, that's I'm not going to do very well after that then. The subject, the title I chose today is no true humanist ? And there's a sort of fairly tenuous Scottish connection for this title. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Baginni.flv's famous no true Scotsman example of a bit of like dodgy thinking. The idea is there was So in this story, there's this Scots gentleman who's reading his newspaper about a particularly heinous crime that took place south of the border. And he, I won't try and do an accent, but he basically sort of tut-tuts away and says, you know, this is a sign of how awful the English are, and, you know, no Scotsman would do such a thing. Anyway, the next week he's reading the paper, and there's a report of an equally heinous, similar crime in Scotland and everything, and he's said, well, what do you say now? And he says, well, no true Scotsman would do such a thing. Now, there's a very serious point here, really, which is this is called, this has become known as the no true Scotsman move, as a kind of rhetorical trick that essentially, you know, we sort of create an idea of the way something should be, and faced with counter evidence, rather than give it up and say, well, you know, I'm wrong then, clearly there are bad Scots as well as English people, we kind of just redefine our terms in such a way to make it narrower. So, you know, yes, but no true Scotsman. And I think there are similar things go around. We'd certainly be quick to accuse religious people of this, you know. When people say, these people who do these suicide bombs, they're not true Muslims. People say, well, there you go, you see, you're just trying to sort of like define what a Muslim is in a way that suits you because it's too inconvenient. We might find ourselves doing the same thing for humanists, but not in the context of suicide bombing, I wouldn't hope or expect. So this is the no true Scotsman thing, but the interest I have is really, I guess, you know, what does it mean to be a humanist? What is required of being a humanist? And I think it's a little bit dodgy. I mean, the column in Humanité magazine I call The Reluctant Humanist, and I'm doing this series now for Comment is Free Belief, which is in its third week. If you haven't seen it, have a look. And I'm always a bit of a kind of a reluctant kind of member of any group, really. That's partly just temperamental, let's be honest. I wouldn't claim this flows inexorably from logic. We all have sort of temperamental inclinations to join or not. But I do have reservations around humanism, and I think it's quite important the way it sort of frames itself. Here's what I think here's a true humanist for me. These are a couple of statements, I think, which capture it very neatly. So this is one from the HSS website. We can lead good and worthwhile lives guided by reason and compassion. That's a basic encapsulation of what the humanist ideal is. Couple of key words there: can, not will inevitably, or must, but we can. We are capable of doing that. There's no way of capturing anything in a couple of sentences which doesn't at least gloss over some complications. Guided by reason and compassion, that seems fair enough to me. I mean, yeah, whether we'd use the word compassion or not, I mean, I think the main thing is we understand that by a combination of just, you know, human feeling, sympathy, empathy, all those things, and our intellects, you know, together we are capable of leading worthwhile lives. And in the Amsterdam Declaration, there were two. The first was 1952 or something, and then they did another one in 2002. I'll quote throughout this talk from the 2002 one. There's a nice little statement in there which says, humanism is undogmatic, imposing no creed upon its adherents. Now really, the reason I've got these two things up here is I kind of think that's about as much as you can say about what a true humanist is. I think anyone who kind of like meets these criteria, I mean, there may be, we can probably think of some clever counterexamples. There might be some additional things which would rule you out, but basically this is it. And what concerns me, I guess, is that I'm not sure what else follows from this. It seems to me that if I agree to these two things, then there is almost, not quite infinite, but there's a huge amount of variety about what I then might later, in addition, believe, specifically believe. But I think for all sorts of reasons, there's a tendency in humanist organisations in particular, perhaps, to try and sort of like fill all this out in certain ways. Now, I think in a lot of the ways, the desire to fill it out is a pragmatic and practical one. If you think, why do we naturally need humanist organisations? It's quite a good question, really. I think it's no accident that they're not actually particularly numerous in their memberships in Britain, given the amount of non-religious belief there is. A lot of people think, well, religion for most people is no big a deal in this country. Why would I want to join an organisation? I think the clearest reason why we need organisations is because partly to counter the voices of lobbying groups which have a very specific faith agenda, and also provision of certain services as well. I mean, the HSS has expanded tremendously, done very well in recent years with its ceremonies division, and these are very important things. So there are reasons for the organisation to exist. But I think, nevertheless, once it kind of does exist and then wants to be a player in public debate, there's a sort of a constant drive to sort of have positions, because if you're invited to give a comment to the radio, to Parliament, or all that kind of thing, it gets a bit tedious if you simply say, oh yeah, well, we can give you a range of different reasons which you might like to take into consideration when weighing things up rationally and calmly and reaching your own conclusion. People want to know, where does humanism stand on this? And I think the other point about that is that, as a matter of fact, of course, there are tendencies. I don't think we should deny that. I'll come to that a bit later. So there tends to be a certain amount of agreement on certain issues amongst humanists. And I think that can lead people to kind of like confuse that, as a matter of fact, agreement with something indicative or central about humanism. So this is what I think the true humanist is. But then in addition, I think we've got some other things. When we fill this out, the first kind of thing that happens is you get vague stuff, because in order to fill it out and make it sound interesting, you need to say things, but actually they end up being a little bit kind of, not vacuous, but they're not really informative. These are all for the Amsterdam Declaration again. Humanism values artistic creativity and imagination and recognises the transforming power of art. Well, sure, but I mean, don't most of us, I mean, it's almost like that's a preemptive defence against people who claim to are obsessed with science, I guess, maybe. It affirms the worth, dignity, and autonomy of the individual. Again, well, so do a lot of other people, recognising our dependence on and responsibility for the natural world. I don't know if that was an addition in the 2002 declaration that wasn't in the 1952 one. Someone's nodding their head. I think it was. But yeah, again, it reflects the need to sort of show we're kind of in tune, we've taken on board this environmental agenda. Committed to education free from indoctrination. Again, well, kind of who isn't? And I think that follows up from the undistinguished thing. A lot of the things, when you try and say what humanism stands for, I mean, in a sense, you're saying things which may be true, but they're not distinctive of humanists at all. These aren't things that can be claimed for humanism, and nor do they distinguish humanism from other people. So in a sense, it's kind of not really, I wonder if it's even relevant to say it, really. For example, a political party, the Conservative Party, say, we in the Conservative Party believe, that Newton's laws of motion work very well at the macro scale. So you go, well, of course you do, so does everyone. But I mean, what's that got to do with you being a conservative? Do you see what I mean? Now, it's not quite like that, because these are connected with the humanist belief. They're not distinctive. So again, affirming the worth, dignity and autonomy of the individual human being, the greatest possible freedom compatible with the rights of others, certainly not uniquely humanist. A duty of care to all of humanity, including future generations, again, not uniquely so. The third one's very interesting, because a lot of the time in the Amsterdam Declaration, and also in other statements you see of humanist belief, the attempt is made to distinguish the humanist belief from the religious viewpoint. That's partly the point. I'll come to to that again in a second. But it doesn't always even work. I mean, humanists believe that the solutions to the world's problems lie in human thought and action rather than in divine intervention. I actually think, certainly, I don't think I know a Christian who would disagree with that, frankly. I mean, there might be a few. I mean, you might say, ultimately, you know, the ultimate deep thing requires, well, it's not solving the world's problems, though. Our ultimate salvation for eternity may depend on the divine, but you know, there's a very strong current in Christian thinking which says that on this planet it's down to us to solve the world's problems. That's what all the gospel is all about, you know. I mean, it's not at all cherry picking from the gospels, I don't think, to sort of point to Jesus's teachings as being all about the need to sort of, for people to do what they can in this life. So it doesn't even distinguish us from Christians there. And again, humanism advocates the application of the methods of science and free inquiry to the problems of human welfare. Now, again, I mean, the point is, you could say in broad terms, everyone would agree with that as well. Now, you might think, hang on a minute, but we can think of examples of where church and religious organisations prevent this kind of thing, stem cell research, you know, contraception and so forth. So clearly there are religious groups who are against this, but they're not against the application of methods of science and free inquiry to the problems of human welfare. They just think there have to be limits on that. But that's also something that's acknowledged elsewhere in the Declaration and acknowledged elsewhere in other statements. So neither do humanists believe that science should be, you know, applied to everything without any respect at all for human values, dignity of the individual, issues of justice and so forth. So of course, the kind of objections raised by the Pope and so forth to the use of science are different to the kind of objections we would have, but we all agree in the basic principle of applying science to solve problems. And finally, the overzealous. Now, I say overzealous because I don't disagree with either of these things, right? But I don't think, personally, and I've chosen examples from the British Humanist Association here, so as to cause no offence to anyone in the room, I'm not sure why it is that a humanist organisation should actually take stances on either of these issues. So the BHA has said, you know, assisted dying should be legalised and accompanied by strict safeguards to protect vulnerable people. As a matter of fact, I agree with that. And as a matter of fact, I can see why a majority of people who are humanist in their outlook would tend to agree. I can certainly see that. But I don't think there's anything kind of inevitable about that. I don't think there's anything sort of that necessarily connects that view with the humanist position. In fact, you know, you could say there's a certain form of humanism which, you know, it really does stress the value of human life, almost the sanctity of life view, really, the sanctity of the human just without the sanct bit, whatever, without the sort of religious bit, and might argue that no, you know, we mustn't legalise assisted suicide because we must do everything we can to preserve society's sense of the unique value of every life, and that although we can see that in certain situations the most humane thing may be for someone to end their own life, it's kind of better to have the situation we have now where people sometimes often manage that by fudge, evasion, bit too much morphine, than to go down the road of legalisation. Because remember, this is legalisation, it's not even about the moral issue here, this is about the legal issue. Because legalisation, one could have this serious worry as a humanist would open the door to too much abuse inevitably. And it is important, by the way, to stress that the legal and the moral position. There's nothing inconsistent at all about claiming that someone has a moral right to determine their own fate, but fate. They certainly have a moral right to determine their own faith, their own ultimate fate. But at the same time, that there's no way of framing, you could believe there's no way of framing a law which isn't going to be too open to abuse. So you adopt the kind of fudge, because that's what we have at the moment. We have a kind of fudge. We know that people can help others to die in certain circumstances and they won't get prosecuted. The system, I think, should change, right? I'm not advocating the status quo because I think that makes life too difficult for a lot of people. But nevertheless, there's no consistency at all in imagining a humanist who would be against this. So I don't know why the humanist organisation should think it should take a stand on that matter of law. Similarly, scrapping the Human Rights Act, that should be capitalised, Human Rights Act, would be an embarrassment for the UK, says the British Humanist Association. But again, this seems to be very over-involved, I think, in minutiae of policy. I mean, the Human Rights Act is a specific legislative device designed to achieve the safeguard of certain rights and things. It's certainly not the only conceivable possible way of doing so. There are other things. I mean, a lot of the people who want to scrap the Human Rights Act want to replace it with some kind of British Bill of Rights, which have all the same kind of things in it. Their argument is essentially one about sovereignty. You know, they don't want the British government to sort of have to kowtow to some foreign organisation, which they think this kind of does. But it doesn't necessarily mean you're against the idea of human rights, that you're not going to have more human rights. You could even imagine a situation in which someone might advocate the scrapping of the Human Rights Act because they might believe that having a different act might actually have more safeguards for the kind of rights that people want. So again, given all of this, and given that I think the organisations, humanist organisations, should be as inclusive as possible. Remember the fundamental thing at the beginning, no dogma, no creeds. I don't think that there should, the temptation to sort of like have policy positions on things, I think it's something which should be resisted, except where it's, you know, kind of pretty much unavoidable, pretty much, you know, directly related to freedom to live without religion in a culture which has been historically very religious. So these are various ways in which I think things can go too far. But I suppose there are some more specific things. There are actually a number of things where I actually think it's a bit more than that, where I think humanism can go wrong. By the way, just to clarify, in case it's not clear already, I'm not saying these things in the spirit of you know, these are things which are wrong with all humanists and all humanist organisations. Okay, I know there are, as my basic premise is, there are huge amounts of different opinions, shades of different opinion with organisations. So all these things I'm talking about are things which sometimes happen to a certain degree with some people and some organisations. All right, and their tendencies I want to caution against. So just to make it clear, I'm not trying to sort of like portray organised humanism as being totally steeped and overtaken by these, what I think to be misguided or false views. Well, the first one, I'll do this briefly because this is very familiar and some people actually get bored with it. The idea that it's all too religion focused. I do think it's true, unfortunately. I went through, again, the British Humanist Association's press releases recently, and they display 10 to a page, you know, at a time. And on a typical page, 8 or 9 were all about religion and church and objections to things like that. Just 1 or 2 would be about something else at most. Now, is that healthy? Now, I know you might say, well, yeah, that just reflects contingent historical facts. We live at a time where there's still a lot of ecclesiastical, theological power and influence. That's the battle which needs to be fought at the moment. It's not surprising that there's all that focus. But, you know, I don't know. I don't think, I mean, I think it leaves us open to the taunt people have, which is, you know, you keep going on about how you can live without religion, but it seems that you can't because your whole raison d'etre seems to be to get involved with them. You know, if you say you can live without religion, just try it for a week, you know? Try going a week without having a go, you know? So I think there's something in this. And the Amsterdam Declaration says humanism is a response to the widespread demand for an alternative dogmatic religion. I mean, I don't think it should be. I mean, in a sense, that's kind of there's a kind of historical truth in there, isn't there? We wouldn't need perhaps humanist organisations if the history of the human race had been different and religion hadn't have been so dominant. So in that sense, you could say humanism is a response to that. But I think it's really important that we really get clear on the idea that, as a matter of fact, you know, humanism isn't parasitic on religion, which is the accusation. Okay, and I feel like I'm particularly frustrated about this because I wrote the very short introduction to atheism about 2003, and I was really keen. I was really sort of like keen to stress in the book how it wasn't about religion. I didn't make the book about religion. I made it about other things. And since then, so much of what has been in the public eye about humanism and atheism has been religion focused. I've kind of felt, oh dear, this isn't really doing my case any good, is it? But you know, if it were true that it was parasitic on religion, it can't be true, because it would mean that if religion faded away, then humanism wouldn't exist. But that's not true. If religion faded away, humanism would have triumphed, you know. You just wouldn't have noticed, because there wouldn't be anyone else around. So I do think there are important reasons why we do need to guard against that, but that's very familiar, so I'll skip that. There were more specific things too. I think, and this is where we get a bit more philosophical perhaps. I think that if you read through various things like the Amsterdam Declaration and other kind of statements of humanist belief, I think it tends to be too rights focused. Here's just the Amsterdam Declaration statement. Humanism supports democracy and human rights. It holds that democracy and human development are matters of right. The principles of democracy and human rights can be applied to many human relationships and are not restricted to methods of government. Now that last thing I'll come to in a second. Now the point here is anyone who studied politics, philosophy, things like that will know that the whole notion of rights is actually a really, really tricky one. It's a very, very difficult one, a very fraught one. You know, Jeremy Bentham said, you know, talk of rights was nonsense, and you know, inalienable rights are nonsense on stilts. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but not the nonsense on stilts bit, because that's the famous bit. You know, rights are very, very, very tricky to deal with, and I think the dominant view, in jurisprudence and philosophy is that rights are actually they are a human creation. Actually, you know, that's the whole point. They're one of the things that we should perhaps take pride in. We created them; they weren't just there. It's only because we have decided that we want to imbue our fellow creatures with certain, you know, privileges and protections that we have rights. And that means that they're not natural, they could be taken away, they're negotiable, they can change over time. So the more resource we have, perhaps, the more rights we can grant to people. So if we are a wealthy country, perhaps we can actually give people a right to clean water. That's not a natural right, because, you know, in the absence of a rich enough country with a good enough infrastructure, you couldn't provide everyone with clean water. Now, it's nonsense to have a right which is impossible to claim. That wouldn't make sense. So, you know, rights are actually something that are very specifically things that we create and remold, and therefore, you know, I think we have to be very sort of careful about sort of talking about them as though they were these core things that are just there, and also are not restricted to methods of government. I mean, I can understand how you might flesh that out, but there's a way in which that's obviously false in terms of rights. Rights only really make sense as legal entities. You know, that's what gives rights force. They are legal. They are created by governments and between governments. So the idea of rights independent of government, I think, doesn't really make sense. So again, I think there's too much emphasis on rights. And why is this important? You know, you think I'm getting nitpicky here. I'm bringing my sort of a philosophical hat on, and I'm picking away at something that isn't important. Well, it's important because we go back to the key thing: self-image of humanism. What is it that humanism takes pride in? I think it takes pride in clear thinking, rigorous thinking, being rational about things, not hiding behind dogma and faith and so forth. And I think that means that it has to be committed to think things through as rigorously as possible, and so therefore not use notions like rights in a kind of, you know, cheerleading kind of way, if behind it there isn't the rigor isn't there. Too consequentialist in its ethics. When it comes to saying, going back to the beginning, the thing I'd say is absolutely definitive of humanism is the belief that we can live good and meaningful lives. Then you've got the question, okay, so on what do you base this? Well, again, there's that broad answer, reason and compassion, fine. Where do you go from there? it's a really open arena, I think. You know, the whole issue of ethics and morality, again, anyone with any familiarity at all with the philosophy here, I'm not saying anyone who, you don't have to have studied it formally or anything, will recognise that when it comes to, it's particularly the basis of ethics, a hugely contested issue, which there's not really much agreement at all. And we're talking about not much agreement here amongst philosophers and thinkers, the majority of whom have no belief in God or anything, so the disagreement isn't because they have different theological stances. So when it comes to sort of specifying what precisely ethics is based on and how precisely we should work out values, huge amount of disagreement. And I think therefore humanism can't afford to nail its flag to one particular mast. As a matter of fact, what tends to happen when you look at again, statements is they do tend to put them in terms of consequentialist views. So the BHA did a poll in 2007, which is now notorious, partly because a colleague of mine ripped into it in very slightly rude terms, I might say, or intemperate terms, but the substance of his criticisms was correct. The survey had 3 statements which were meant to be indicative of a humanist outlook on life, and one was that you were supposed to agree that what is right or wrong depends on the effects on people and the consequences for society and the world. Well, again, I think this is one of those statements which, if understood very, very broadly, very, very generally, is something that virtually no one would disagree with. Okay, again, even the most kind of fundamentalist sort of nutter religious type could agree with this in a very broad sense. They'd understand the world as being broader than just this physical world, okay? But they would say, you know, of course, things are wrong because they corrupt our souls, because they separate us from God. These are things which are harms to individuals. So saying it's the consequences in that sense is going to be, no one's going to disagree with that. Where it becomes more of a specific issue, in philosophy, where it becomes philosophically interesting to say that it's consequences that matter, is to say it's really about weighing up, you know, benefits and harms. It's the kind of cost-benefit analysis way of doing ethics. So it's not some general thing. It's actually about, you know, let's look at this action over that action. Let's look at the direct results of the consequences in terms of whether it increases whatever it is you think should be increased, well-being, happiness, whether it decreases it, and then decide what's right on that basis. Now, again, this is hugely contested, and a lot of people say that's not actually the way to do ethics. That way of doing ethics actually undermines something very important about ourselves. And the classic example would be that the objection that when you go about ethics in that way, you justify using people as a means to an end. So if by doing something to a small number of innocent people, so doing something, you know, killing them off or something, or letting them die by negligence, you can save a larger number, then you should do that. And now, you might think that is what you should do, and I'm not saying it's an indefensible position, but clearly there are plenty of people who can see grounds saying that that's not right. That undermines something really important about ethics. The moment you try and reduce all ethical choices to a kind of a cost-benefit analysis, if you like, of a particular decision, you're undermining something important in humanity. So either the emphasis on consequences either becomes so broad that it's kind of vacuous, or it's very too specific to capture the possible range of ethical stances a humanist might take. And it also glosses over the difficulty, which is which consequences, because again, what you find is that you get different words being used. So this one in the Amsterdam Declaration talks about maximum fulfillment, but we have fulfillment, we have flourishing, we have people's abilities to satisfy their own preferences, and we have happiness. Well, which one of these is it? You know, I mean, it's unless you can say that, it becomes vacuous. As it happens, I think the tendency is to end up emphasizing the hedonic elements too much, and the emphasis tends to be essentially on kind of just happiness as the ultimate human good. Human beings can act to give their own lives meaning by seeking happiness in this life and helping others to do the same, which is the BHA website's thing. The Amsterdam Declaration talks about fulfillment. The atheist bus down in London, what was that? There is probably no God. I really like that bit. I really do like the inclusion of the probably. I thought that was a very appropriate bit of kind of caution, really flagging up the fact that not dogmatic. But then the next bit was something like, you know, stop worrying and enjoy life or something. Now, I think this is a bit glib. I think there's a bit of overcompensation going on in humanism historically. That what happens is that, you know, people are so kind of like, oh, surely life is meaningless if there's no God. Life, if this is all there is meaningless. And we want to show that we can live happy, fulfilled lives, right? Can. It's like the thing about can being moral. And so I think there's an emphasis to try and sort of talk up that aspect. But first of all, I mean, there are many choices you can make, priorities you can have in life, and it's certainly not obvious that happiness in any kind of normal sense is the one that you should choose. Wittgenstein is very interesting with this. It's a very telling story. Wittgenstein, the philosopher, as many people know, was quite a tortured soul, really. No one would call him jolly. I don't think many people would. And if you say, did he have a happy life? Most people would say no. On his deathbed, though, I mean, I think he was literally on his deathbed, he's sort of like, one of his last words to the person who's looking after him was, tell them I've had a wonderful life. It's a really interesting word, wonderful life. It wasn't a happy life, but it was a wonderful life. He had achieved a lot. It had been very rich and fulfilling. And I think sometimes the emphasis on happiness, you know, the happy human symbol, and you know, the things like that, I think does detract. And and a slightly deeper worry. I have a slightly deeper worry actually, which is only beginning to sort of get under my skin, which is that actually I wonder whether this in fact causes a certain turning away from the less happy aspects. I mean, if you think about it, there are reasons why this, I'm very suspicious of this kind of way of theorizing, which is essentially a kind of way of doing psychoanalysis on groups. It's suspicious because it's kind of an unverifiable thing, but one can't get away from the fact that sometimes you have to think about what might be the motives people are not aware of. You know, if you think about it, if we do embrace a life which is finite, where we all die, where there is nothing beyond and so forth, okay? I mean, sure, we do that, we come to terms with it, and we recognise we can still there's still the possibility of a good and meaningful and happy life. But of course we do know that a lot of people never achieve that. Never. A lot of people die miserable, having had awful lives, and there is no redemption for them. This is a really uncomfortable fact about humanism. Now, I think that as a humanist, you know, part of this whole thing about being grown up, mature adult, not hiding behind comforting myths, is that is accepted, right? But it has to be properly accepted, and to be properly accepted it has to be acknowledged fully, and it shouldn't just be sort of swept under the carpet, under the sort of like more official thing that, yes, but actually we're happy, like, aren't we? You know, we're happy humanists. So I think that the emphasis on there's a reason why we might not want to think too much about that, because it reminds us that actually ours is a viewpoint you adopt at a certain cost, if you like. You do lose that comfort. It's all very well pointing to people and saying, you silly, immature people with your false comfort. We don't have that comfort, and we are human, and it can be hard to live without that comfort sometimes. So it's good not to think about that. So that's one thing, but again, but it also leads us in the wrong direction, because is it really just about happiness? I really don't think it is. I think if I thought that the only alternative to life without God was just some kind of hedonic kind of like party while you can, I think I'd be quite depressed actually. You know, I like to think that there's more to life than just fun and happiness. Fulfillment's not a bad word, because at least it's open, you know. Did Wittgenstein have a fulfilled life? Probably. But the hedonic aspect, I think we've got to be careful about that. You know, we don't want to overcompensate too much because people think we're miserable by sort of making out that things are happier than they are. Let's be honest, it's a miserable world a lot of the time. We've got to be honest about that. I'll speed up a bit because I do want to have some time for conversation. I've got 3 more things to get through though. Too much faith in human nature. This again, this historic tendency, I think there's something in this, you know, that I mean, the HSS website, I don't entirely disagree with this, says there are more things that unite humanity than divide it. In some senses, that's true, right? But that's kind of an aspiration. I mean, we have to find those things. That's the real point. You know, we need to find and work on the things that unite us. Because left to our own devices, the things that divide us very easily come to the fore. You know, you look at the history of the human race, there's a heck of a lot of division. As a matter of fact, you might say, my God, you know, the divisions are clearly the more salient facts in human history than the things that unite us. You know, we've only recently got to quite sort of large international organisations. When I was a kid, you couldn't even go to France without sort of going through 2 checkpoints and things like that. You know, we were literally divided by borders. So I think that when we talk about what unites us and what divides us, we do have to sort of think about if we're going to champion the things that unite us, I think we have to see that as something we create. It's not something that's just there. It's not just a bland fact about humanity that there's more that unites us than divides us. There could be, if we worked for it and found it, more that united us and divided it. But other things, again, going back to that BHA poll, human nature by itself gives us an understanding of what is right and wrong. I just think that's so, if only it were that easy, you know? I mean, no, that's just not true, is it? I mean, human nature is in fact really complicated. Human nature has all sorts of things in it which have nothing to do with right and wrong and can lead us away from it. It does seem to be human nature to be more look more kindly on people who look a bit like you than don't. I mean, again, the psychological data for this is pretty robust. Okay, there are all sorts of like prejudices, self-serving biases, etc., which don't point us to right and wrong at all. So. You know, human nature by itself gives us an understanding of what is right and wrong. I just think that's just false, actually, and it just seems to portray, you know, if I was John Gray, I'd sort of patronisingly say this is a touchingly naive faith in human goodness. But he's got a point, you know. Humanists believe that morality is an intrinsic part of human nature. Well, again, you know, I think it's complacent as well, you know. It's not. I think with all these things, I think there's an important strand, I think, of humanism which risks getting lost in some of the negatives I'm talking about, which is an important strand is the role of humanity in creating its own values and creating its own goodness, right? And I think it's important to recognise that it doesn't do that simply by finding what's already there and going, aha. It's a project which is serious work and difficulty and always risks failure. Too much faith in science is another one, I'm afraid. Perhaps Robin Ince is going to talk about science later, so I should perhaps leave that to him. Science is wonderful. I mean, you know, and again, it's one of those things perhaps we want to defend it against people who are going to knock it. But again, I find myself, John Gray, I found ambivalent towards John Gray, because I think in broad brush terms, he often says things which are very, very true. He tends to say them again and again and again and again and again and again. But then, you know, I suppose I probably repeat myself more times than I'd care to admit as well. Yeah, I repeat myself more times than I'd care to admit as well. But, you know, he makes the point quite well, which is that why is it that humanism seems to assume science is its ally, when in fact there are lots of cherished beliefs that a lot of humanists have about human beings, which science could turn out to undermine? Our goodness. I mean, I think science has undermined any idea we have that goodness is an intrinsic human thing. I think it's shown that we are, you know, a mixture. You know, we have the good and the bad in us, or both of them. I'm not sure what proportions. You know, it may be that naturally left to our own devices, goodness wouldn't even be in the ascendancy. I don't know. What about free will and autonomy? You know, I mean, these are things. There's a lot of stuff going on here in neuroscience and everything, which is, you know, undermines certainly a lot of common sense views about what free will is. Okay, so the idea that science is going to be our friend, well, it's going to be our friend to the extent to which we're committed to uncovering the truth, right? So in that sense, if humanism involves a commitment to truth, science is our friend. but it may not be our friend in the sense of like vindicating certain views we have about humanity and how we should live. That is an open question. So I think we need to be very careful about, you know, there may be times where in order to preserve the values we both have, we might decide to fight against science rather than go with it. Not deny the evidence of science, but say, you know, we need to work against what science tells us about us rather than just accept it. And finally, the old one is, again, an old one, is too much faith in reason, unfortunately. I have just a few things there. I mean, reason comes up again and again, obviously, as part of the self-image. And here's a little thing, a little finding I came across, which I think is very interesting. I think it generalises out. It's the first bit of scientific evidence I came across for something I'd long suspected was true. What I'd long suspected was true was that philosophers were actually extremely vulnerable to irrationality. In a sense, more so than other people, precisely because they were convinced that they were paragons of reason and logic and rationality. So, you know, an example of that is gender, sex discrimination, equality of women. In academic philosophy, the proportion of women in the field is very, very low. It's lower than virtually any other subject. It hasn't other subjects which have traditionally been as male dominated as philosophy have become more mixed than philosophy. In the sort of like better departments in Britain and America, the proportion of women is about 20%. It's really at the higher level, even though at undergraduate level it's 50-50. Well, why might that be? And I think one reason is that in a lot of other disciplines, people, when they sort of, you know, all this consciousness rating was coming out, people said, you know, well, look, you know, we have these biases we're not even aware of, and, you know, we have to work hard to change the structures. People went, yeah, that's true, all right, fair enough. In philosophy, you know, this is obviously a little caricature, cartoon thing, but I think the attitude was really, listen, in philosophy, philosophy is gender neutral. We don't have any truck with that. We just follow the argument where it leads. And that means we don't have to do anything specifically to address issues of gender inequality, right? Because there's nothing gendered about the law of the excluded middle or the principles of logic. Now, of course, there is nothing gendered about the law of the excluded middle or the principles of logic. That's not the point. Even though people are consciously working with that, on other levels, people are doing all sorts of things on another level which are being driven by prejudices and stereotypes. It affects women as well as men, by the way. I mean, you know, no one's free from this. Women aren't free from negative gender stereotypes. There's that really shocking experiment, which is quite amazing, that if you give a maths test to some boys and girls, and with one of them, at the top it asks you to tick whether you're male or female, and the other it doesn't. That's the only difference between the two tests. What you find is that the girls do worse on the test where they're asked to tick their gender. And other experiments have suggested that simply being reminded of your gender in a context where there is a stereotype about who performs better will affect performance, right? So all these, too much digression, all these things suggest that, you know, that we're not immune from these things. Now, humanism is on the side of reason. It champions reason. And I think that is a good thing, obviously, and that's what we should be doing. But it leads to the danger that because we are, of course, we're the scientific rational lot, it can actually blind us to the limits of that and the ways in which we're not. I think you have to be very, very honest about this and really be clear, because, you know, well, we all know it. We know people, and I know I'm not rational all the time, and I'm sure we all know we're not. And it's very important that we don't have too much faith in reason, and too much faith. Actually, I could go on with this at length. In fact, I will go on about it at length one day. It's one of the books I want to write. It's all about reason and its limits, etc., etc. But for now, let's just say, let's acknowledge the fact that A, reason has limits of its own. That's true. But B, we certainly have huge limits as users of reason. You know, even if reason were all powerful, we are not all powerful users of it, and we need to remember that. And that, I think, leaves us enough time for people to have a go, say how much they agree with me and etc., or heckle. So we've got, I think I was told because we started a bit late, we were able to go on a little bit later. So we do have time for questions. Anders has another microphone. Who would like to lob the first grenade? Fire the first shot, or I saw 1, 2, 3. So yeah, I tell you what, let's remember this. From the first round of hands, we have this gentleman, this lady, and that lady. If we make sure we take them before anyone else. But I mean, but this guy was here as well. I include you in the first round. Yeah.
I was very interested in your deconstruction of humanist discourse, but really I'm left with the question, what does this teach, what does it leave us with? It reminds me of the idea of going to the farmer's market and coming back with a farmer. You're fracturing our sureties. But if we become reluctant humanists, what does that lead to? A kind of humane scepticism. In vacuo, leaves us all reading your books and nothing else.
Very lovely question, very well put, I have to say. Yeah, no, it doesn't leave us with very, in a sense you're right, it doesn't leave us with very much, but I think that's the problem is it's like, nature abhors a vacuum, so do organisations. I think we should resist the temptation to think that, we need to keep adding more to it to make it more substantial. I actually think the few things that really are at the core of it kind of are enough. I don't think we need to worry about other things. So, okay, so as an organisation, what do? Well, you exist. As I say, there's a lot to do in terms of campaigning and services and things like that. And then there are things just of mutual interest, as I say. I mean, look, what does a church do? Not be honest here. How much of what a church does is to do with the specific beliefs of the church? Well, some things are. Other things are vaguely related. They have, Mothers' Union meetings and baking days and things like that, youth clubs, etc., etc. A lot of the things churches do have nothing to do with the teachings of Christianity. But, there's a certain fellowship there based on the core things. And also, people don't talk about religion a lot at churches. I don't know how many people here went to church regularly or remember it. But, as soon as the service, I used to go to a Methodist church when I was a teenager. It was great. You got through the church service and, I did kind of have a belief, so it wasn't just biding the time. Once that was over, you spent more time at coffee afterwards than in church before, and you weren't talking about religion, So I think that in terms of organisations, if it has less to do, fine. Although actually I think certainly you've got enough on your plate just for the things that have to be done without trying to expand it into lobbying on issues which you don't have to. And in other things, well, it's like anything. We're just people who have enough common interests that we're just going to do fun things together. We're going to listen to Robin Ince tonight, Go to comedy, have comedy nights, read books. I agree. Okay, should we take, just to keep the microphone going in the direction with this guy, then you and you, yeah.
Before coming here, a Christian friend of mine just suddenly asked me, what is humanism? And I replied, it's Christianity without religion. And that response was not just intended to be trite, it was intended to defuse any conflict. If he sees me as a Christian who doesn't share the doctrinaire aspects of it, then we're not going to have a contretemps. Another interesting thing arose this summer when a number of parents got together and they were discussing what their children were going to read at school, and a surprising number said, my son's going to read philosophy. And then one parent, a woman, said, it seems to be a boy thing, philosophy.
Yeah.
And I'm rereading Robert Wright's book on the moral animal, and he makes it very clear that it's proven, reasonably scientifically, that it isn't a boy thing. That women are much more intuitive, they're in tune with emotions, and they, by nature, this is a requirement for a requirement that allows women to control situations and control men. They must be operating at the level that David Hume, when he said, the intellect is the slave of the emotions. So therefore, the males are really the slaves of female. So I wouldn't. I would say that that it is a boy thing, and it just so happens, like driving trains tended to be a boy thing. There are things that are boy things, and we shouldn't knock it. And women are not identical to men, shouldn't be identical to men, and never will be identical to men. And that's no bad thing. Thank you.
Well, there you go. Well, first point here proves the point we'd say about, you know, diversity of opinion. Does this mean this person is no true humanist, or that he's the only true humanist in the room? Is as much a humanist as anyone else? Actually, I think there have been taboos against acknowledging gender differences. I think that hasn't been helpful. At the same time, I don't think it's at all as clear as you're suggesting that these differences that are pointed out are innate and in transgender. The book by Cordelia Fine, I think, called The Gender Delusion, I do recommend reading that. A lot of the experiments and data which is routinely pointed out to people as like to prove that, you know, men and women are intrinsically different, turns out to be quite dodgy. And the other thing, of course, is that you know, if you look at even if there are different emphases and everything, first of all, it's all the differences are only statistical averages anyway. So any given woman may be more masculine according to the stereotypical traits than any given man, and particularly if not overall, then when it comes to specific things. And the other thing is that, you know, these things are highly complementary. So I think that there have been certain trends in moral philosophy, for example, which you might attribute partly to the greater involvement of women in the field, but they're things from which the thinking of men have benefited as well. So one has to be very careful. That's all I'd say about that. We're whizzing on, so could we take the microphone to the two people at the back who are waiting? Is this woman here, and then the woman over there?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much. I really thought that was something I could almost agree with almost everything, and this is very rare for me. But I think the gentleman over there asked, what does that leave us with? And these first few points about what true humanism actually is about, this very bare construct of what humanism is about, I think this is actually what it leaves us with, and we should continue to have debates on this very level, always being aware that this is actually what true humanism is. Mainly the being not so dogmatic, because this morning I've heard a lot of things being shoveled down my throat which I consider highly dogmatic, and I think that is one thing where humanism could actually outdo religion, by always reminding ourselves that true humanism is actually discussing on the basis of being undogmatic. The second thing I wanted to say is about the happiness that you mentioned. I don't think it is that important to make a big distinction between happiness, fulfillment, and all the other words that are being used in the Amsterdam Declaration. But I wonder whether you said in your psychoanalysis of our group, you said that we are trying to maybe kind of cover up the fact that happiness is not to be taken for granted. I understand it more in the sense of striving for happiness, because it always mentions seeking happiness, living a happy life. I'd like to know what you say about that. And my last thing, it's very brief, I just want to know, when you say if we look for the greater good in society, and we, for example, you mentioned the example of someone or a small group being killed for the greater good, for the greater benefit, and you said something in humanity gets lost through that. Could you specify that? I didn't understand what you meant, what exactly gets lost. I'm not sure I'm going to answer all those things and leave time for the last questioner, but I'll try some of the key ones. And I've lost the middle one already. The first one, let me just focus on the first one perhaps, about what's left. I'm glad I was actually on the train up this morning. I wasn't here this morning. It saves me from having to agree or disagree about whether or not we heard a lot of dogmatic things this morning. I don't know, I wasn't here. Wait.
But actually, when you were talking there, I thought, actually, that is the answer to this guy's question, where does that leave us? I mean, one thing it leaves you with, the fact there is a lot which left open, it means that there is a space for these things to be discussed, and as it were, for people to come together and to discuss the variety of positions without feeling to need that they have to form a consensus on them. So agreeing that it is possible to lead a good and meaningful life, you know, without comforts of afterlife and so forth, rather than compelling us to then we have to then specify how exactly we do that. It certainly leaves a lot of room for us to discuss and work out how each of us is going to fill that out. So there is, as you say, an important role for it to be a space of debate, and therefore with it disagreement. Could you in 3 words remind me of your second point? Could you remind me what your second point was? Just 2 or 3 words to remind me. Oh, the happiness thing. Well, yeah, no, sorry. I just think that, well, no, I really do want to avoid the H word. I think it's too, you see it all the time in reading quite a lot in positive psychology and things like that. And, yeah, people sometimes try and get around that by saying, we know happiness doesn't just mean, you know, feeling good. It means other things. But then they carry on using the H word, and it tends to inevitably come back to that or sound like that. I think that one should be more serious about this, and I think you have to drop that word. It is too misleading in its connotations. It does lead people to think only of feeling good and positive affect, as the psychologists call it. If we seriously think there's more to life than that, we have to drop the H word. This will have to be the last question, I'm afraid, but I'm around immediately afterwards. I'll be here later, Robin Ince, so corner me if there's something you wanted to say, which you didn't have a chance to. Yeah.
Okay. Some of the things have already been touched on. One thing I would like to repeat, I was saying, is thank you very much for giving us all quite a lot to think about. One of the things, sorry, I'm going to say more than one thing, but is when you said you didn't like this definition of humanism as an alternative to dogmatic religion. Now, I mean, I can understand the reasons you said that, but the fact is, I think that really is a fairly fundamental thing to most of us here. What is the appeal? Because some of us were just discussing at lunchtime, found it a quite distressing situation that people who were religious somehow are sort of shocked, or not were and are shocked when you say, oh, but I don't believe in God. And to have somewhere to sort of hang your coat hanger, which in a place which is out of dogmatic religion is very important. And I think you were talking about rigour and so on. I think atheism and rigour brings you to the atheism, and I think we need to go beyond that to the humanism by having something more positive. And this is the trouble where, you know, I come with Terry, that, you know, what do you leave us with? And as you yourself said, nature abhors a vacuum, so things have to sort of creep in. I think it's just too little to leave us with, you know, the purely rational thing. We have to be allowed to hang a few more things on it. And if that overlaps with the various religions, I don't see why that's a bad thing.
Oh, I've got no problem with overlapping. In fact, overlaps are good. I think sometimes we should acknowledge more of the overlaps. You know, I'm all for building bridges with the more reasonable religious people. It's, yeah, extremism and dogmatism is more of an enemy to me than religion per se. That's where I stand. In terms of, I mean, you're talking about, you know, the space. I think that it does vary where you go about what function a group will have. I think in most places in Britain, most places, but not all, you know, people are just, they're just not serious about religion, so you don't get that sense. Now, I spent about nearly 3 months in America, though, earlier this year. I've written a piece which will eventually get published, I'm assured, in the FT Weekend magazine on atheism in America. And you can see there how the isolation of not believing really means, you know, having a group which is explicitly kind of an alternative is necessary. So I acknowledge the fact that there are occasions where the value and the function is precisely that it provides that alternative. But that certainly shouldn't be, you know, we should be, in a sense, working for that not to be the status quo, and be quite keen for that not to be the only, you know, that's not the main reason for adopting the position. You know, to give us sort of an analogy you may not think works, you know, if I say, I don't sort of watch, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an analogy that's not going to sound pretentious, but okay, someone who listens to Beethoven, let's say, Beethoven is an alternative to that nonsense hip-hop R&B stuff that fills the radios, okay? Because that's not why, you're not listening to it because it's an alternative to that. That just stuff doesn't interest you, it's rubbish. You listen to it because it's great, you know, or you think it's great. In the same kind of way, yeah, I mean, in a culture where there's a lot of this stuff around, you want your little haven. You go, oh great, you know, I love coming to this because it gives me a way of escaping that, and that's reasonable. But ultimately, it's for what's positive about it that you go to it, not for not because of the fact it enables you to get out of the other thing. So I think that's the key point. But obviously, the extent to which the negative, the role the negative plays, I think is going to vary a lot. Culture to culture, even place to place. Not all parts of the United Kingdom are the same, and also depending on an individual's life story as well. You know, there are obviously people who have been brought up in families or situations where the religiosity has really been a major issue with their lives, and for them, therefore, again, that the fact that it is an alternative does become more important. So I think you're right. I think I'll acknowledge in what you say that I perhaps should have stressed the fact that, you know, there are times when that seeing it as an alternative is a legitimate thing. It's just, I don't think that should be the only way of looking at it, and I don't think we should be striving what our positive vision is. We should be making the alternative to religion aspect of it, not the centre of things. Valuable in its own right. We've gone way over. Your meeting's about to start, isn't it?
Oh. Can we have a big hand for Julian, please?